insurance. All
Are we
right, we'll record it.
All right. So I guess I'll introduce myself, right? I'm
Yeah.
Jack Smith from William A. Smith and Son Insurance. We have multiple offices in Orange and Dutchess County. In Dutchess, we're most easily accessed, most likely for more of your members in our Poughkeepsie Journal building office. You can reach us at 845-561-1706 or visit us online at wasmithandson.com. Today I was just going to talk about two things basically. One being lawyers professional, lawyers E&O, lawyers professional liability. It goes by a number of different names kind of depending upon your era and who you're talking to and what your concerns might be. And then I was going to morph that a little bit into talking a little bit about cyber insurance, because there is some tie between the two that people in their practices should keep in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then Jana, if you have some questions even from the things that I say, I'm happy to respond
Sure.
to those too, or if you get questions sometimes from some of the members as relates to these topics, I'm happy to kind of cover those too.
Okay.
Especially if we don't have anybody else come in, that's a
Yeah.
good way to at least cover a few things.
Okay.
So anyway, professional liability, professional E&O, lawyers E&O, again, whatever you want to call it. Our firm's been working with various law firms for over 50 years on that particular type of coverage. We have access as an independent agent to a number of different markets. What I would tell you over the last few years, and most of you have probably seen this, is premiums have been increasing. And a lot of people say, well, why? I haven't had any claims. Well, there's a couple of different reasons that happens. Number one, there's a finite number of carriers, insurance companies who provide lawyers professional. It's not the whole realm of universe of carriers that are interested in providing professional liability for anybody and then professional liability for attorneys. So that's one of the issues that can impact pricing in the marketplace. The other is over the last 5 years or so, there's been a greater preponderance in lawsuits against professionals, whether that's attorneys, whether that's accountants, whether that's insurance providers, whether that's medical providers. All of us are often held to an even higher degree of standard than normally we had been because of societal changes and people's choice of who they think is responsible for what. So we all know that. We try to keep good records and good systems, and so those are some of the things that you should be thinking about when you look at lawyers professional. If you go out to the marketplace, you call me and you say, Jack, I'd like some options for my lawyers professional. What can you do for me? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with an insurance application from one of the carriers that does lawyers professional, because I can use that with a number of different carriers. And what it goes through is, what are your areas of practice? And they want to know by revenue what your areas of practice are, up to 100%, obviously. They want to know how many attorneys you have on staff. They want to know the names of those attorneys. They want to know if the attorneys have been taking continuing education in any form or format. And then they want to know what your risk management practices are. And for your firms, whether they be small or large, that's how are you checking your conflicts of interest? How are you logging in contacts from your clients? How are you billing? Are you using the same kind of retainer letter for every single client? Do you have standardized forms and formats that you use? Or are you doing kind of a one-off for everybody? And obviously, as legal professionals, the more standardized you are, the less you go off the grid for every single client that you have, the better a risk you might be to the insurance company, because the things you do are more predictable. the better the systems that you have for finding whether you have conflicts of interest within your firm. If you have more than one person, the better risk you are, because there's less chance of suits arising. The more stable your workforce is within your professional base, the better risk you are, because there's less chance of attorneys kind of coming in and out of your practice and doing things differently in one place from the next. Those can be gaps or open holes, if you will, in your practice's experience that could cause suits later on. And lawyer's professional is generally a claims made coverage. And so the claim that's being made, the suit that's being brought against you now that may have happened 8 years ago, when somebody kind of traveled through your firm and their on their upward progress in their law career, may have not paid attention to the practices and policies that you had in place, and maybe something happened. So again, you're being sued now for something that happened then. So those suits that could arise are your experience in a policy setting. And so the carriers look at, how many suits have you had? How many, has there been any payments? Have there been non-payments? Have you done things to change or rectify your practices that maybe you didn't have in place in the past? Those are the kind of things that the underwriters are looking at to derive premium. Do you work with public companies? Do you just work with private companies? Do you do a lot of real estate law? Real estate law has been a higher rated class of law for the last 5 to 10 years in terms of insurance and premiums for errors and omissions. And so those are just some of the things to keep in mind. There are still, while the universe is smaller in terms of companies that provide lawyers professional, there still are a number of options. And so, that's kind of what I would say about that. The only other thing I would add, because I'm going to transition from this to cyber insurance, is most of the lawyers professional policies now have a very limited amount of cyber liability only insurance on them, which means if you're breached, if you have an extortion or ransomware event, it's probably not going to be covered on your lawyer's professional. If there's a very specific breach of information relative to a client that you're working with, and that's the specific breach or incident, that may be, depending upon the lawyer's professional policy, part of the network security coverage that comes with it. But again, that's not really what's considered cyber insurance anymore. So I don't know if anybody has any questions just from that first bit of information.
So I hear this a lot, especially now there's been some changes in the county to serving on assigned council panels and what is required for E&O to be on those panels. And so I'm hearing from a lot of people that, it's doubled in cost. I've never made a claim. Is there an average cost that you see? Is that something?
Not
really.
It's really very dependent upon the insurance company that you're with,
right?
The practice that you're engaged with, the length of tenure of your firm. Certain companies will give credits for CE. There are some that don't. So, those kind of all factor in. And then the length of time you've been with the carrier. So claims made policies have a step period.
Okay.
And that step period is, they're inexpensive to begin with. They go up for 3 or 4, sometimes up to 5 years, because as a claims made policy, the longer you're with that carrier, the greater their exposure is to claims that may have happened in those first 4 years. And then it moderates, and then it's generally relatively flat unless you add different specialties, more attorneys, grow your revenue, or on a more macro basis, the market's just not good in terms of claims versus premium,
Right.
and the carrier takes a rate increase. So that's kind of what's happened in the last few years, is a lot of the carriers have taken both a real rate increase, that base rate that they might, charge against your number of attorneys or your revenue, depending upon how they're going to do that, and where you are in your step process. So you can get a bit of a double whammy at
Right.
times. And so often when you change carriers, you're going to save money the first year. You
Right.
just have to be conscious of the fact that for the next, 1 to 5 years, it's going to catch back up, but you're probably still in a net savings situation, because you saved enough at the go in where it takes 4 years to kind of get back to where you were at time. That's in a perfect world where you had no claims, you're in a very innocuous, legal practice and that.
Right.
What
are the specialties that generally have a higher
that don't have a
higher
so
premium?
For sure, real estate, any sort of real estate related.
Interesting. Okay.
Tends to be much higher. Plaintiffs' attorneys tend to be higher than general business practice attorneys. Intellectual property law can be significantly higher than other forms of legal practice. Those are really the
not
ones.
Family court and criminal, though.
No, not that I've seen.
It's interesting because we handle the complaints here, and 99% of the grievances that are filed come from family court or criminal.
But if they don't,
and it's so interesting to see, right, that like those are not the ones that they consider to be like a higher risk.
Right. But ultimately it's who sues, right? Because the insurance is really only responding to a lawsuit by somebody making.
Well, so a grievance is usually a first step in a lawsuit, because you want the grievance committee to say that they breached the code of ethical responsibility. Then once you have that, then you go on and
sue for something.
So that's why it's interesting to me to see like the. But those are the ones that handle high volume money.
Yeah, but I also don't see a lot of attorneys who are, defense attorneys in criminal cases, and that's their only practice. Right. To me. So maybe there's a reason for that too, that they've found, a option in their minds that works. But we do see a lot of, again, the real estate related law practice, and construction law can be quite expensive.
Yes. My sweet mate does construction law exclusively, so I see some of those clients are a little interesting.
Sure, absolutely.
Very interesting. So cyber liability, what's going on with cyber liability these days?
So cyber, the big hot buttons right now are ransomware. Or the big hot button is ransomware.
Right.
And ransomware often starts from a phishing scheme, not to be confused with going down to the river and throwing your pole in. But when you've got employees who are getting bombarded with emails every day, and particularly in businesses such as, whether it's insurance, healthcare, law, banking, where we tend to have a lot of attachments that people are sending us via email, sometimes secure, sometimes not secure. Those various emails and attachments are not always from friendly people. Sometimes they're from, bad actors, as they like to call them in the cyber world. And so what then happens is you open that email not knowing that it's from a bad actor, downloads code onto your machine. If you're in a network environment, that code travels from one machine to the next inside the environment. And if you don't have good, malware protection on the front end, companies like CrowdStrike or WebRoot or some of those different, firms that can help you detect those sort of things, you're kind of stuck. So then you have two scenarios that happen. You have a demand from a bad actor for usually something like Bitcoin, and where maybe before it was 10 Bitcoin, which was maybe worth $3,000, 10 Bitcoin now might be worth, $500,000 or more, just based on the value of Bitcoin. So, excuse me, I don't know if you can hear that. My phone's ringing, sorry.
Okay.
So anyway, cyber insurance, getting back to that, cyber insurance has a number of different components to it. It used to be called cyber liability because people were more worried about getting sued because of, allowing data to be breached by a third party. But now really cyber is a number of different things. It's first party expenses, which are things like forensics and remediation of the malware that's been put into networks or machines. It's business interruption insurance, which is, hey, I do all this work on my computer system and now I can't do the work and I can't bill for it. And I'm pretty much shut down for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, who knows? And so I have a loss of business income, just like when when you had a fire or a water event in your office before, that's business income. This is the new world of business income from a cyber related event. You have the demand itself for the ransom to get your data back or get access to your database again, depending upon the carrier, the insurance company, and how it's paid. That can be, part of what's covered on a policy. We always have to know who's asking for the ransom, which can be difficult sometimes because there are times when carriers can't pay the ransom because it may come from somebody on one of the government terrorism lists that they just can't pay, that they're just legally
They should
not.
all be on the government terrorism list,
They
right?
should, but
I'm
some
sorry,
of them
but they're
right. Some of them are
okay.
state sponsored though, and some of them are just like, guys and gals in a barn in Iowa somewhere that decide to just, they're good at computers and they just throw out a bunch of these attacks. And so cyber insurance now has become not just a form of risk transfer, but also a tool, because most of the carriers, before they will even give you a quote, are pinging off your domains and email addresses to see if there are open ports behind the scenes that you don't know about that make you more vulnerable. And they will give you a report with their price quotation, with their proposal that says, here are open ports, we need you to fix this before we're even going to write you a cyber policy, or we'll write you a cyber policy, but you got 30 days to fix
Right.
these, because these are, major issues in our mind. And then you have the policy itself, and where it used to be a little easier to kind of talk to somebody about, hey, $1 million of cyber insurance is a great place to start, because if the ransom demands $10,000, you've got $990,000 left to deal with your forensics and lawsuits and other things that might crop up. But again, now, because that's based off of this cryptocurrencies, asking for the same number of Bitcoin is a substantially higher amount. And so now the extortion amount alone could eat up the entirety of your cyber insurance policy. Then you may be on your own for the rest of the expenses, because typically they have an occurrence or a per claim limit, and then an aggregate policy annual limit, kind of like a lawyer's professional policy does. So those are just things to keep in mind when you're looking at this stuff. And people will say, all right, well, if I do really good IT best practices and I have a daily backup and my backup is kept somewhere else in a separate, system or in a vault, or, in some entirely separated mechanism, I could be asked for ransom and choose not to pay it, and just let them take my the data that they maybe stole, maybe didn't steal. And I'm going to start working off of yesterday's data set and keep my business operating. And then I'm going to have, a forensics guy look at my computers just to make sure there isn't some malware still sitting in there that's, doing keystroke pictures or something else to steal other user IDs and passwords.
Yeah, I mean, for a smaller firm, it might be cheaper just to buy new computers. Right? Reinstall everything, buy new computers, and
what you just
on.
then have to know is where you can't just move on, though, is then you need to know what New York state law is relative to figuring out if any of that data that you had was personally identifiable and breached. And then you've got to inform anyone whose data may have been taken, that it was taken, and then you have to offer them credit monitoring services, all of which are generally available in these cyber policies as well, but all part of that aggregate limit. The crunch now becomes that there's so many cyber claims and so many ransomware attacks that where it used to be pretty easy to get high limits of insurance in cyber, now it's much more difficult. So getting $1 million is relatively easy. Getting over $1 million is becoming extremely difficult unless you're a really large corporation where you're willing to pay, a lot of money for the insurance because it's worth it. And then we can get, silos from a bunch of different carriers to build a tower of limit. But so that's become a challenging thing. If you're a 5 or 10 person firm and you have a little network and you've got your local IT company supporting you and they're doing a great job, but all of a sudden this happens and you had no backups, then you're the one that's probably going to pay the ransom. You're probably going to be down for a period of time, and hopefully you've taken care of that in some way. Just know that your business owner's policy without cyber coverage added to it's probably not going to help much.
Right.
Your general liability policy, your umbrella policy, they don't pertain at all. Your lawyer's E&O is probably only going to pertain to lawsuits that could be brought by your clients who you're working with at the time, who possibly their personally identifiable information was taken, but it's not going to respond to your whole data set. And so there you go. It's happening more and more, even in our area.
We had a firm that had an issue now a little over a year ago.
I recall hearing about that. I was not personally involved in that particular one, but I do recall hearing about it. We've had municipalities in Dutchess County that have been attacked. It's just becoming a very common thing. So it's something to think about. And again, like I would tell anybody with any form of insurance, first your best bet is your own internal risk management. And what are the things that you can do in your policies, processes, and procedures to try to ensure that that doesn't happen. There are a lot of different technology solutions, like I had mentioned before, that are available to help with that on the front end. They won't stop it, but they may stop it. They may not stop it, but they certainly make it more difficult for the bad actor. And then insurance is kind of that backstop on the backside to make sure for that if you do need it, it's there. So that's kind of my